Oh, howdy all, grab yourselves a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. So 3.13 has been a very unusual spoiler season for Path of Exile. This time out from the league start, so about 17 days, we'd normally be getting the major teaser trailer. But we know that it's going to be run in a different way this league. So as yet, we don't actually know the name of the league or the expansion. We don't know much about the core themes, and we're just getting tiny little teasers. However, this one has a little bit more information in it than it might initially look. So, the first thing that I tried out when I came to this site is I moused over everything to see, oh, is anything actually hyperlinked? Like, is there anything that if you mouse over it, it'll bring up some information? Unfortunately, that is not the case. These are not links, these are just simply images. Now, there's 9 different images here, and amongst them, we've got these gloves. I presume these are boots, but I'm actually not certain these are boots. These could be gloves as well. And this helmet, these gloves, these boots. And then we've got these 4 curious things. So really, we can't say much about these other than they're unique items that are being introduced, almost certainly, that we know nothing about. Maybe one of them's a cosmetic outfit as well. Maybe even more than one. But mostly these are going to be unique items. These are the interesting ones, though. Now, these look to be stylistic, and you can see that because these two look identical to each other. I've looked in pretty closely at them, and I do believe that these are the same as each other. It makes me think that these are sort of weighty consumable items, so items that you can have multiples of, but that take up a bit of space or whatever. Something along the lines of scarabs. Maybe they're a temporary consumable like a scarab. Maybe they're a longer lasting consumable like Legacy. Legacy League had its, they weren't watchstones, there was some other name for them. League stones. Legacy League had its League stones, which were basically a scarab that worked for multiple maps. And then you have the Ivory Watchstones that drop from Sirius, which again are like a scarab, except they work for 12 to 18 maps. And then they could be a permanent marker, a milestone as well. A permanent milestone being something like one of the 8 golden watchstones that you acquire while you're filling out your Atlas of Worlds. So that's my initial speculation, is that these are going to be one of those 3 things, either a one-use consumable related to mapping, a multi-use consumable relating to mapping, or a milestone marker, quest item type thing related to mapping. I really don't know which of those it's going to be. And likewise, this has some image that definitely conveys a concept of land in some way, as does this. So again, I'm thinking these are definitely mapping related. This one here is rather confusing because it looks like 2 things at the same time. It looks both like a support gem, a blue support gem of some description, which it may well be, but it also looks like an imprisoned world, a watery world that's been locked into some sort of seal. So on that basis, I really don't know what to make of this. But that's talking about this little image here. This was not the only one the only thing that was brought up today, and in fact, the other one has much more information in it. The last little trivial thing that I'll point out here is that in one of the previous teasers related to the upcoming patch, you'll notice that various pronouns referring to the main antagonist were bolded. And we'll have a look here. This is the Good Tidings Nomad message. This was the first teaser that was brought out. I think this was the 16th of December, so 2 weeks ago. And essentially it's a message to your character from the antagonist of this league. And it made me speculate at the time that the key antagonist was going to be the God of the Harbingers, who was sort of driven out at some point. Then there's other people that thought, no, actually the God of the Harbingers was the Elder all along. And then there's also people who thought that it was Calandra. Now, I'm starting to think Calandra is looking more likely than I did at that time. But you'll notice that the pronouns here referring to the enemy were italicized. I'm made to stand out. The word she was really sort of thrust in your face as like a weighty word. That hasn't been done here. I was kind of expecting the word her to be capitalized, and it wasn't. I'm not sure if that means that these are written by different characters in lore, or whether there's some other reason for that. That could be as simple as just as someone going through and doing a, seeing what looks like a capital H and thinking, oh, that looks like a typo. Anyway, the last thing that we got, though, was the brief history of the Atlas lore. Now, this is really interesting. So the first, I guess the way that Path of Exile endgame has evolved over time, the very first endgame, which is before I started the game, was I think it was called the Maelstrom of Chaos. Initially, you completed there was only the first 2 acts at this point. You completed the first 2 acts on normal difficulty. Then you would be able to attempt them on cruel difficulty, which would be harder, merciless difficulty, and then ruthless difficulty. Then, after you beat the Val Oversoul on ruthless difficulty, you then were put into, you then got access to a new zone that kept getting harder the longer that you kept at it. I don't know everything about the Maelstrom of Chaos. I didn't really play it. When the ruthless difficulty was removed and the game and the third act was introduced, that's about the time I started playing. And the end game at that point, and this would continue up until quite a while after the introduction of Act 4. The end game at that point would be that you'd complete the game on normal difficulty, on cruel difficulty, on merciless difficulty, which was like getting to the end of Act 10 now. And then after that, you'd get access to maps, but the maps would have nothing connecting them. You could look up a list of what all the Tier 1 maps were, what all the Tier 2 maps were, all the way up to, I think it was Tier 12 at the time, maybe 13. And there was no overarching storyline behind the maps. They were just basically places to go, worlds to visit, worlds to destroy, monsters to kill. Then, with expansion 2.4, they introduced the Atlas of Worlds. And this was what I would say, although this article says it's the first true endgame overhaul. Oh, well, actually, yeah, it was the first one since the introduction of maps, so that's true. So the introduction of maps was the first overhaul, but then the second endgame overhaul was the Atlas of Worlds, which provided a cohesive additional quest. So once you had completed the core storyline of the game, which at that point was still completing acts 1, 2, 3, and 4 on 3 different difficulty levels. Once you'd done that, you then had a new antagonist to chase down, and that was the Shaper. You didn't know much about the Shaper, and you didn't discover that the Shaper was Zana's father until, well, if you were me, you discovered it by reading the Path of Exile subreddit and seeing the data mined sound information from the game. But if you stuck totally in-game, you didn't discover that the Shaper was Zana's father, I think, until you actually confronted him in combat, or maybe just before you confronted him in combat. But essentially, he was portrayed as a mysterious architect type figure. I guess probably the closest equivalent I can think of would be the architect from the Matrix series, not from the good Matrix film, but from the mediocre one, the one in the middle. This sort of mastermind manipulator that exists outside the maps and is a really is like a callous and cruel, callous but not necessarily cruel, like a disinterested, dispassionate godlike figure who only cares about perfection, and will quite happily say, "Oh, we made a mistake on that world. Let's burn it and start again." So that was the type of figure that the Shaper was then. And then they're also talking about how there was the memory fragments. Now, I have a much less favourable memory of the memory fragments than this article has here. So the way that the memory fragments worked was that there were 7 of them that could appear in maps at random. Now, they weren't staggeringly rare. Think of them as being maybe a bit like Labyrinth Trials, maybe a little bit harder to get the set of than the Labyrinth Trials were. Some of them had minimum levels of maps, and they would contain some of the storyline of the Shaper versus of the Shaper, and would provide you with little hints that might point you in the right direction. That actually, the Shaper had a daughter that was exiled. I think the Shaper was had previously been working for High Templar Venerius. All sorts of things like that. Actually, a lot of this storyline would later be fleshed out in the Synthesis League. So anyways, these these memory fragments were random, and I remember that being quite frustrating trying to find the last one for one of the challenges. There wasn't any gameplay benefit to having all 7 of them, but it was necessary to complete the storyline of what was going on. And there was, of course, I think it was in 2.4, that there was a challenge to find and read all of the memory fragments. And this is one that everyone that was playing as much as I do now would have each of them 5 times. But back then, when I was probably more of a 300 map a league player, I was in the sort of spot where RNG could lock me out of finding one of them in a league. Anyways, then we had War for the Atlas. And this introduced the Elder as a new foe and positioned the Shaper as a character who was much more heroic than he'd been in Atlas of Worlds. The Shaper was someone who had, in the Atlas of Worlds, he'd been that callous and cruel mastermind figure. In the War for the Atlas, he became very much more about, I will defeat the Elder no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. And so the Elder was introduced as this sort of eldritch horror type figure, Cthulhu-esque, whereas the Shaper was more of a human antagonist and then became ultimately an ally. So War for the Atlas did retcon some of the information about the Shaper and also revealed his relationship to Zana much earlier. So that was something that I think they decided that because in the Atlas of Worlds endgame, the Shaper was very much a difficult encounter. I would say that nowadays, the caliber of player that could beat the Shaper during the Atlas of Worlds expansion was pretty much the same as the caliber of players that can defeat all the Crystal King, defeat the Replica Cortex, some of the other really tough encounters in the game now. So, the Elder and the Shaper would each try and seize control of regions of the Atlas, and they would be fighting each other in a system that was both random, but that player agency could have a big impact on how that randomness worked out. And they then said, as they say here, storyline-wise, they introduced the Shaper in increments, positioning him as an entity to be wary of, then introduced the Elder as something the Shaper is afraid of. And then counterintuitively, you could fight and defeat the Elder much earlier than the Shaper, although you couldn't permanently defeat the Elder. Well, permanently. Everything's impermanent in this game. But you couldn't defeat the Elder. You couldn't defeat a cataclysmic defeat on the Elder until you had completed Zana's storyline entirely, defeated the Shaper, and then gone back and fought both of them at once. Now, it is also important that they added the Uber Elder fight a whole league later. So Conquerors of the Atlas then comes along and changes the storyline where the sealing of the Elder and defeat of Shaper has happened, but it was done by a previous group of characters. And I've always thought of this as your characters from 3.2 through 3.8 were the Elder Slayers, and now they've gone bad. And then once they've gone bad, they have now started basically taking over all of these worlds and starting to threaten Oriath as well. They mentioned that they're a little bit underwhelmed by how Cirrus doesn't appear for a long time, and I think that was a mistake in terms of the design of the encounters. I think it would have made a lot of sense to have Cirrus appear, perhaps the first time that you defeat the 4th Conqueror. Just have Cirrus appear, threaten you, and drop your character to 1 health. To 1 health and 0 energy shield, and then just leave. I think that would have been something that would have been an impactful way for Cirrus to just appear and be a present antagonist. Because in the War for the Atlas expansion, you were encountering the Shaper and the Elder from the first time that you hit a tier 6 map onwards. In Conquerors of the Atlas, you encounter the Conquerors, the lesser Conquerors, Baran, Veritania, and the like, earlier. But you don't encounter Cirrus until much later. Now, one thing, though, that's very important is that GGG have then said, well, we have a few goals that we want to try and get the highest points of each of these 3 series of these 3 eras of the game, and try to create a 4th era that hits the high points and also doesn't make some of the mistakes that were made in the past. And so I think ultimately This is the big news for 3.13, although it's still cryptic and it doesn't have much hard information on what we're going to see. So they want to introduce some of the ominousness, that's a really difficult word, that came with the eldritch feel of the Elder. I don't think that you'd call a Shaper an eldritch feel. Want to inject some story into regular mapping with an element of unpredictability. So, first, on this first point of capturing the, I guess what you'd term cosmic horror feel of the Elder, and maybe the sort of otherworldliness of the Shaper, especially in the 2.4 endgame, which is the War for the Atlas. The Atlas of Worlds endgame. I think this is an interesting idea. Actually found that Cirrus was quite an ominous foe as well. But the thing that made Cirrus so ominous was that he had that human side to him that was quite recent. And so you could tell that he was someone who had become nihilistic. And that was much more realistic in a lot of ways to make him into an antagonist than, say, the Elder's cosmic horror themes. I think let's see what they do with this. I think there's a lot of potential for it. We also want to inject some story into regular mapping with an element of unpredictability. This is fine. I'd just be very cautious about. I would say that there's a real problem here if you're going to have a situation where 5% of the player base are going to run 500 maps and not see this. I think they should run some simulations as to how long it takes to encounter all of the storyline, given various parameters about how players might play the game. And if there's going to be sections of the storyline that are heavily gated behind randomness, I think that there should be some sort of entropy system added in there. So what I mean by the entropy system is that evasion in the game is deliberately non-randomized. If a monster has a 70% chance to hit you because of your evasion, they will never hit you 4 times in a row. If it was random, they would hit you 4 times in a row 24.01% of the time. But it's non-random. And the way that they do this is that basically there's a hidden variable that increases by 70 each time that the monster hits you, the monster that has a 70% chance to hit you, and this will then, every time that this ticks over 100, you're hit. Every time it doesn't tick over 100, you're not hit. So for instance, if your variable's at 50, the first attack is a swing, that jumps you up to 120, that's a hit because it ticked over 100, and then you drop back to 20. Next swing comes in, plus 70, you're at 90, that's a miss. Next swing, plus 70, that's 160, that's a hit. Next swing, 200, you're at 60, then plus 70 is 130, so that's a hit, and it's now down to 30. You can play around with this if you want to convince yourself, but you will never be hit 4 times in a row under this entropy system with a monster that's 70% to hit you. And this is essentially a form of non-randomization, and I think that you should definitely consider, GG should definitely consider this, because undoubtedly the 3.13 challenges will have some ties to this system, and these sorts of storyline encounters can be really frustrating if you're missing one of them, because there's no way to target farm them, and they will be really, really annoying to just, continually see the ones you've already got again. The other thing that may be difficult with them is that, with things like Labyrinth trials, you can always just simply liaise with other players in order to get them, but it may well be that with a storyline beat, you can't do that. We also want to address some of the omissions and gaps in the Conquerors of the Atlas storyline and build upon what was already there, although it's important to note that the new storyline exists in addition to and in parallel to the existing Atlas content. So this is the firmest comparison that I think we're going to see a situation where the Atlas itself is going to remain as it is, the quest to get all the 32 Watchstones, or largely as it is, but you will have additional objectives off to the side. It may be that because 32 Watchstones is a big undertaking for people at the start of the league, it may be that gets shortened a little bit, in much the same way that when they added Act 4 into the game, they shortened some of Act 1. So Act 1 used to have a zone between I think between immediately before the ship graveyard from memory. That zone was removed. And likewise, there are a couple of other zones that were downgraded or that were removed at that point as well. A couple of zones were made shorter and so on. So we may see something similar to that happen where getting to your 32 watchstones becomes a little bit quicker than it was in the past because you've got something new to work towards. I don't know. Finally, we want to provide narrative hooks for the future. This means that some questions will remain unanswered for a little while, but if you're a fan of speculating, I don't think you'll be disappointed. Here, I think we've got confirmation that they're planning to provide some seeds for what's going to happen with the Path of Exile 2 storyline. I am under the impression, now this is entirely speculation, this has got no real foundation to it. Tangmazu, the Trickster God, who is the Delirium antagonist, I believe that he was introduced in Delirium primarily to provide a sort of foreshadowing of the primary entity that the Path of Exile 2 storyline is going to be run against. I could very well be wrong on that front. And finally, the whole information ends with with a reminder of the announcement. So the official announcement for the new league is going to be on January the 7th American time. So that is currently, I think it's 9 days away, and it's not going to be the normal format. It's going to be on the Path of Exile Twitch channel. And as well as that, I expect there'll be a lot of people, myself included, either restreaming it or doing commentary on it. I haven't decided which way I'm going to go. But because this league is starting so soon after that, it's starting only 8 days after the announcement, I expect there'll be some more cryptic teasers like we got today, and there may even be some more decisive teasers as well, with more information in them. Anyways, that's what we've got for today. If you've got any comments or questions, fire away below. Otherwise, I am going to get back to finishing my challenges in the Heist League, and then I will see you when we get some more spoilers.